When did karma destroy someone right after they mocked you? Story 1. A few years ago, I was working a customer service job at a tech store. One day, a guy came in with a broken phone screen. I explained that the warranty didn't cover physical damage and offered him repair pricing. He smirked, loudly mocked me to his girlfriend, saying, "Look, this guy thinks he's some genius, but he's just a minimum wage nobody who can't even fix a phone." I kept calm, rang up his repair quote, and he strutted out, saying he'd fix it himself for half the price. 10 minutes later, we heard shouting outside. He'd tripped on the curb while checking his phone, dropped it on the pavement, and the already cracked screen shattered into a spiderweb mess. His girlfriend laughed so hard she almost cried. He walked back in, red-faced, and paid full price for the repair I'd quoted, plus an extra $50 for the now worse damage. Story 2. In high school, I gave a presentation on climate change, and this one kid in class kept whispering jokes and mocking my stutter. When I got to the Q&A part, he raised his hand just to sarcastically thank me for my science fiction story. The teacher didn't intervene, but karma came faster than I could. He launched into his own presentation right after mine, on volcanoes, and tried to do a dramatic demo with a baking soda volcano. He'd put too much vinegar in, the thing exploded early, spraying all over his notes, his clothes, and the front row of students. The teacher docked major points for lack of control over the experiment, and he had to stand there dripping vinegar while the class giggled. Story 3. At my last job, a coworker named Alex mocked me constantly for bringing my lunch from home, calling it sad little Tupperware meals while he bragged about eating at fancy restaurants. One week, he pushed it further by showing off a massive lobster dinner receipt in front of everyone, saying, "Some of us know how to live." That same day, our boss announced budget cuts and hinted layoffs were coming. Guess whose name was on the list? Alex's extravagant expense reports were a big factor in the decision. I kept my sad little Tupperware and my job, while he had to pack his desk. Story 4. I was jogging at the park when two guys on bikes passed me, one shouting, "Run faster, slowpoke!" They laughed and sped off. About a minute later, I rounded the corner and found them both standing awkwardly. One of their bikes had its chain completely jammed, and the other guy had fallen trying to help. I passed them at my same steady pace, smiled, and said, "Better pedal faster next time." The look on their faces was priceless. Story 5. I was at a family barbecue, and my cousin, who fancies himself a grill master, mocked me for bringing veggie skewers. "Real men eat steak," he said loud enough for the whole table to hear. He insisted on cooking all the meat himself, boasting about his perfect medium-rare skills. 30 minutes later, everyone who ate his steaks started feeling sick. Turned out he'd gotten distracted bragging and undercooked them badly. Meanwhile, my veggie skewers were gone in minutes, and I was the only one not running to the bathroom. His real man reputation took a serious hit that day. Story 6. Years ago, I worked in a small marketing team where one guy, Darren, always had a comment about my accent. I'm originally from Eastern Europe, and every time I spoke in a meeting, he'd mimic me under his breath. One afternoon, we were presenting a campaign pitch to a high-profile client. Darren went first and made a snide remark about needing a translator for the next speaker, while nodding toward me. The client's face instantly soured. Turns out her husband was from my home country and she was fluent in my language. She stopped him mid-sentence, switched to my native tongue, and asked me to continue the presentation in it. I nailed it. The client was thrilled, and we landed the contract. Darren wasn't invited to client meetings again. Story 7. When I was a teen, I worked at a movie theater. One Saturday during a rush, I was sweeping popcorn when a group of guys came out of a screening, one of them loudly saying, "Look at the janitor boy, living the dream." They laughed as if they'd just won a comedy award. I ignored it, until 20 minutes later when I heard a commotion in the lobby. The same guy had gone to impress his date by leaning against the popcorn machine, which tipped just enough for hot, fresh popcorn butter to spill down his shirt and pants. It left huge, greasy stains and made the whole place smell like burnt oil. His friends tried to help, but the stains were there for the rest of the night. Story 8. In college, I was in a debate club. We had a guest speaker from another school, a guy known for being cocky. Before the debate, he smirked at me and said, "Hope you're ready to lose to a real pro." His opening argument was full of overconfident jabs at me, clearly trying to get laughs from the audience. But midway through, when citing a statistic, he accidentally read the wrong column from his own notes, completely reversing his argument. I pointed it out calmly, and the moderator confirmed I was right. The audience erupted in laughter, and the real pro had to spend the rest of the debate awkwardly backpedaling while I picked apart his points one by one. I won unanimously. Story 9. At a neighborhood block party, a guy named Rick kept making fun of my beat-up old car parked on the street. "Man, when's the funeral for that thing?" he joked for the third time in an hour. Later that evening, we all gathered to watch fireworks. Rick decided to show off by doing burnouts in his brand-new truck. On his second attempt, he hit a patch of gravel, spun out, and dented the side of his truck on a mailbox. The fireworks hadn't even started yet, but the whole crowd was already watching his personal disaster unfold. The dent was bad enough that the door wouldn't close right. My funeral car drove me home just fine. Story 10. I was at a work conference, and during a networking lunch, one guy made a big scene about how I was wasting my time taking notes instead of schmoozing like a real businessman. He laughed to the table about how note-takers are just secretaries. Later that day, during the keynote Q&A, the CEO of a major partner company asked a question about a technical point mentioned earlier. No one remembered the exact detail, except me. I read it straight from my notes, and the CEO was impressed enough to ask me to email him later. That waste of time got me an offer for a new job within a month. The guy who mocked me ended up asking me for a reference 2 years later. Story 11. Back when I was bartending, there was a guy who came in almost every weekend. He always acted like he was above everyone, but one night he took it further, mocking me in front of his friends for just pouring drinks while they were out making real money. I brushed it off, but later that evening, he tried impressing a group of girls by flipping a glass bottle like he'd seen in movies. He missed the catch. The bottle smashed on the bar, spraying sticky liquor all over his expensive shirt and shoes. The girls he was showing off to walked away laughing, and he had to awkwardly sit at the bar for the rest of the night in wet clothes while I served the rest of the customers. Story 12. In my first apartment building, there was a guy named Mike who loved pointing out that I drove an old hatchback. Every time we passed in the lot, he'd say something like, "That thing still runs?" One winter morning, after a huge snowstorm, he saw me digging my car out and yelled, "Don't bother. By the time you get that thing started, I'll already be at work." He got into his shiny SUV, revved it for show, and immediately got stuck on the ice patch by the entrance. I drove past him at a steady pace while he spun his wheels, glaring at me through the window. I made it to work on time. He didn't. Story 13. When I worked retail, a lady came in and asked me for a refund on an item without a receipt. I politely explained the store policy, but she mocked me loudly to other customers, saying I must love feeling important, denying people money. As she was about to leave, she spotted a display near the exit and decided to make a scene by swiping a small accessory into her purse. What she didn't realize was that our security guard had been standing just around the corner watching her entire performance. She was stopped before she could get outside, and the look on her face when she realized she'd be leaving with a police officer instead of a refund is burned into my memory. Story 14. In high school gym class, I wasn't the fastest runner, and this one guy never let me forget it. On track day, he jogged backward at one point just to mock my pace. He was laughing so hard at his own joke that he didn't notice a loose shoelace. He stepped on it mid-laugh, went flying forward, and landed flat on his stomach, knocking the wind out of himself. Everyone saw it happen, and even the coach had to take a minute to stop laughing before helping him up. I ended up passing him while he limped the rest of the lap. Story 15. I once worked on a team project with a colleague named Tara who constantly rolled her eyes whenever I made a suggestion. In a meeting with our manager, she interrupted me to sarcastically explain my own idea in simpler terms so I could understand it. Our manager raised an eyebrow but let her finish. When it came time to present the project, our manager introduced me as the one who designed the strategy, and then asked Tara to explain her part. She froze. It turned out she hadn't actually done any of the work assigned to her, assuming she could just piggyback on mine. I delivered my section flawlessly, and she spent the rest of the meeting squirming through excuses while the manager's patience wore thin. Story 16. When I worked at a law firm as a junior paralegal, one senior associate loved picking on me for asking clarifying questions. He'd say things like, "Do you even know how to read a brief?" in front of the team. One morning, he mocked me again during a meeting, then bragged about how he had the airtight case ready for trial. Later that afternoon, while reviewing documents, I caught a glaring error. He had submitted a draft motion to the court with confidential internal notes still visible in the metadata. If I hadn't flagged it immediately, the judge would have seen them. The partners praised me for catching it, while he was told to triple-check with the junior team next time. He never mocked my questions again. Story 17. A few summers ago, I joined a hiking group for a weekend trip. I was slower than most, and one guy, Brad, kept making comments like, "Hope we're not carrying you out of here." When we got near the summit, Brad decided to take a shortcut to show off his mountain skills. 5 minutes later, we heard shouting. He'd slipped on loose gravel and was stuck halfway down a steep incline, too scared to move. I ended up being the one to carefully guide him back up because I had actually taken a wilderness safety course. He mumbled a thank you, but the rest of the trip he kept very quiet. Story 18. At a wedding reception, I was seated at a table with some distant relatives. One of them, who I barely knew, decided to make fun of me for not drinking alcohol, saying loudly, "Guess some people just can't handle being fun." About an hour later, she was on her third cocktail and went to dance barefoot on the grass outside. She didn't notice the sprinklers had just gone off, and she slipped hard, tearing her dress at the seam in front of half the guests. She spent the rest of the night wrapped in a tablecloth. Nobody seemed to think she was the fun one anymore. Story 19. I used to work in an IT help desk, and a department manager would constantly mock us for just plugging in cables, while bragging about how real work was done in his office. One day, he called in furious because his entire team was locked out of their computers. He stormed down, loudly making fun of us while we checked his office network. Turns out the real work he did included accidentally unplugging the main server to charge his phone. We plugged it back in, fixed the issue in under 2 minutes, and left without a word. The whole office knew what happened by lunch. Story 20. During an open mic night at a comedy club, I went up first and told a short story that got a few chuckles. When I sat down, the guy going next leaned over and whispered, "Thanks for warming them up, amateur." He went on stage with this smug grin, but halfway through his routine, he decided to roast a woman in the front row for not laughing enough. Big mistake. She turned out to be one of the club's owners and wasn't impressed. She got up, took the mic, and told him his set was over. The crowd cheered as he slunk off the stage, and I suddenly became the guy who didn't get kicked out. Story 21. Back in my first year at university, I worked part-time in the campus library. There was this one guy, a business major, who always acted like he was better than everyone else. Every time he saw me shelving books, he'd smirk and say, "Man, I could never do something this boring." One afternoon, during midterms, the library's printer jammed and he came storming in, late for a big presentation, holding his USB. He barked at me to just fix it because that's your job. I calmly pointed out that the printer was down, but he could still access his file on one of the public computers if he knew how to log in. He didn't. He'd forgotten his password, and IT wouldn't reset it without proper ID. The smugness vanished as he sprinted out, papers flapping in his hands. I later found out he missed his presentation slot and had to redo the entire project. Story 22. A few years ago, I was on a volunteer team cleaning up a park. One guy, who clearly didn't want to be there, kept making sarcastic comments like, "Wow, picking up trash is so glamorous." He was dragging his feet the whole time, trying to look busy without actually doing anything. Near the end, he decided to lean against a fence post to take a break. The post snapped, Turns out it was rotted at the base, and he fell straight backward into a shallow, muddy creek. The splash was loud enough for everyone to turn around and see him sitting in brown water, holding a half-empty soda can he'd been pretending to pick up. The laughter from the group made him stomp off early, covered in mud. Story 23. I once worked at a small design agency where a co-worker, Paula, openly mocked my minimalist style, saying my work looked unfinished. During a big client pitch, she presented her elaborate, over-the-top design first, complete with flashy animations and loads of text. The client's face stayed polite but unimpressed. When it was my turn, I showed my clean, simple concept. The client immediately said, "This is exactly what we were hoping for, straightforward, easy to navigate." Paula sat in silence while the project was assigned to me, and I was made lead designer. She avoided commenting on my style from that day forward. Story 24. At a crowded grocery store before a holiday, I was standing in line with my basket when a guy behind me started mocking me for buying rabbit food, because I had mostly vegetables and fruits. He loudly told his friend that real men buy meat while stacking his cart full of steaks. Just as we reached the register, the cashier scanned his meat and told him it was expired and had to be taken off the sale floor immediately. The guy stood there awkwardly as an employee wheeled away his entire cart of bad product. I paid for my rabbit food and left while he stood there with nothing but a loaf of bread. Story 25. In high school, our science teacher assigned us to work in pairs on a lab experiment. My partner, Kyle, thought he knew everything and constantly mocked me for double-checking the instructions while he rushed ahead. He decided to pour the chemicals without reading the measurements, saying, "I've done this before." Seconds later, the mixture foamed up, overflowed, and popped the lid right into his face. Luckily, it wasn't dangerous, but he had sticky, harmless goo dripping from his hair and eyebrows. The teacher used him as an example for why you should always read instructions, and I didn't have to defend my cautious approach again. Story 26. When I worked at a car rental counter, a customer came in already irritated, tossing his keys on the counter and saying, "Let's see if you can manage not to screw up this time." I recognized him. He'd rented from us before and complained about everything from the weather to the color of the car. This time, he mocked me for looking like a high school kid and told me to just give me something decent for once. I smiled, did the paperwork, and gave him the nicest SUV we had. An hour later, he was back, flustered, red-faced, because he'd filled it with the wrong type of fuel and the engine had shut down halfway down the freeway. He tried blaming us, but our signed agreement clearly showed the fuel type in bold. He had to pay for the tow and repairs before renting another vehicle. Story 27. At a small town fair, I entered a pie-eating contest just for fun. Before we started, a guy next to me loudly made fun of my tiny arms and told the crowd I'd probably give up after 2 bites. He then spent the first minute shoveling pie like a man possessed, grinning between mouthfuls at the cheering crowd. Halfway through, he coughed mid-bite, inhaled some filling, and started gagging. He was fine, but he had to stop entirely while the judge patted his back. I finished my pie at a steady pace and ended up winning. The look he gave me while I accepted the ribbon was worth every bite. Story 28. During a corporate training workshop, a senior manager who'd always dismissed me as the quiet one made a big show of mocking my low voice in front of everyone. He then volunteered for a group exercise where we had to deliver a short motivational speech on the spot. He strutted up to the front, started his speech, and within 30 seconds completely blanked. The awkward silence stretched until the instructor called time. When it was my turn, I calmly delivered my piece and got a round of applause. Later, the instructor complimented my composure, and the senior manager avoided speaking to me for the rest of the day. Story 29. I once took a beginner pottery class, and there was a guy who came in already boasting about how he did ceramics in high school and knew all the tricks. He made a point of walking past my wheel to laugh at my lopsided bowl. "That thing's going to collapse before it dries," he said. An hour later, while carrying his own perfect vase to the drying rack, he tripped over the stool leg and smashed it to pieces on the floor. My wobbly little bowl? It survived the entire process and is still sitting on my kitchen shelf years later. Story 30. At a family Christmas party, I was quietly playing a board game with some younger cousins when my uncle's new girlfriend came over, smirking, and said, "Oh, babysitting duty for the shy guy?" She made sure everyone within earshot could hear her. Not 10 minutes later, she joined the adults at the dessert table, took a big bite of cheesecake, and immediately found herself spitting it into a napkin. It had been accidentally made with salt instead of sugar by another relative trying a new recipe. The room erupted in laughter, and for the rest of the night she avoided making small talk with anyone. Meanwhile, I stayed at the board game table, happily undefeated in Monopoly. Story 31. Back when I worked in a high-end clothing store, there was a customer who came in often just to browse and make snide remarks about the staff. One day, she picked up a designer coat I was folding and said, "Bet you could never afford this in your lifetime." I just smiled and kept folding. Moments later, she strutted into the fitting room with 3 dresses, ignoring the 2 at a time sign. While trying one on, she managed to get stuck with the zipper halfway up. She had to call me over to help, and the only way to free her was to cut the dress open, meaning she was obligated to buy it. That lifetime purchase was over $600. Story 32. At my old apartment building, a guy named Trent constantly mocked me for taking the stairs instead of the elevator, calling me Mr. Fitness in a sarcastic tone. One evening during a power outage, the elevator stopped between floors with Trent inside, right after he'd laughed at me for walking up. Maintenance said it'd take an hour to get him out. I passed by with my groceries, climbing the stairs in the dim emergency lights, and he yelled down the shaft asking if I had water. I just told him, "Guess you should have taken the healthy route," and kept walking. Story 33. During a team trivia night at a local pub, I was quiet in the first couple of rounds because the categories weren't my strong suit. A guy on my team decided to make a show of calling me the dead weight in front of everyone. When the final round came, the category was classic literature, which just happened to be my niche. I answered 4 out of 5 correctly, which bumped our team from 5th place to 1st. The prize was a $100 bar tab. The same guy who'd mocked me had to toast to the dead weight while drinking on my answers. Story 34. When I was in culinary school, we had a group project to prepare a 3-course meal for visiting chefs. One classmate, Olivia, constantly mocked my methodical chopping, saying it was too slow and like watching paint dry. On the big day, she decided to speed through slicing vegetables to prove a point, only to nick her finger badly enough that she had to leave the kitchen for first aid. I finished my prep and hers in time for service. Our instructor gave me credit for keeping the meal on track, while Olivia had to explain to the chefs why she didn't help serve the dish she'd been assigned. Story 35. At a tech startup I once worked for, there was a new hire who constantly bragged about his coding skills and belittled anyone who asked for help. In one meeting, he made a sarcastic comment about how I probably still Google how to write a for loop. 2 weeks later, he was tasked with fixing a bug in the main product and accidentally brought the entire website down for 2 hours. I was the one who found the error and restored the site. Our CTO made a point of thanking me publicly in the company's Slack, while the expert was told he'd need to get code review approval from me going forward. Story 36. At a company holiday party, we had a karaoke contest just for fun. I wasn't planning on singing, but my coworker Steve kept loudly telling people that if I went up, everyone would be asleep by the second verse. He went first, choosing a difficult high-energy rock song, and about 30 seconds in, his voice cracked so badly that people winced. He tried to recover, but the more he pushed, the worse it got, until he finally gave up halfway through. A few coworkers convinced me to give it a try, and I sang a simple ballad. To Steve's visible annoyance, I ended up winning the contest and a $50 gift card. Story 37. Years ago, at a beach gathering with friends, one guy named Luke kept mocking me for wearing water shoes instead of going barefoot like everyone else. "Scared of sand?" he teased, telling everyone how real beachgoers go natural. Not even 15 minutes later, he stepped on a sharp shell hidden in the wet sand. It cut his foot deep enough that he had to limp back to the picnic table while someone went to get a first aid kit. The rest of the day, he sat in a chair with his foot wrapped, watching us play volleyball. Me and my scared of sand shoes included. Story 38. In college, I was on a group road trip, and I offered to drive my old but reliable sedan. One friend, Derek, laughed at it the entire morning, calling it a grandma car and insisting his sporty coupe was the better ride. About an hour into the trip, Derek's car overheated on the highway, forcing him to pull over while steam poured from under the hood. We ended up loading his passengers and luggage into my grandma car to finish the trip. The entire weekend, every time he complained about being cramped, someone reminded him that at least the car actually worked. Story 39. At an office potluck, I brought homemade chili. A colleague named Brenda sniffed at it and said, "Looks like dog food, I'll pass." She made a big show of getting a plate of fancy-looking appetizers from another coworker instead. About 20 minutes later, people started noticing she wasn't around. Turns out those appetizers had gone bad from sitting unrefrigerated too long, and she spent the rest of the afternoon in the restroom. My chili? Gone by the end of lunch, with coworkers asking me for the recipe. Story 40. When I worked as a rideshare driver part-time, I picked up a group headed to a concert. One guy in the back seat started mocking the way I pronounced certain words after hearing my accent, nudging his friends to laugh. I ignored him and drove on. About 10 minutes later, he got a notification on his phone. His digital ticket wouldn't scan because he'd accidentally bought it for the wrong date. His friends still went in while he stood outside frantically trying to find a resale ticket for triple the price. As I drove past after dropping them off, he was still pacing outside the venue. Story 41. Back when I worked in a small-town diner, we had one regular who loved to make fun of me for just being a waitress. Every time I took his order, he'd make some comment about how I should aim higher or get a real job. One Saturday morning, he came in with a date and started the same routine, loudly enough for her to hear. Right after placing his order, he went to the restroom. While he was gone, his date leaned over to me and whispered, "Can you split the check? I'm leaving." She walked out before the food even arrived. He came back to an empty booth and a full bill he had to cover himself. I didn't say a word, just set down his plate and walked away. Story 42. In high school drama club, I got cast as the lead in our play, and a guy named Rob couldn't hide his irritation. He constantly mocked my rehearsal notes, saying, "You're taking this way too seriously. It's just high school theater." On opening night, he decided to improvise his lines to get laughs, but ended up skipping a crucial cue that set up my next scene. The problem? It also cut off his own big monologue later in the act. The audience never even realized it was missing, but his parents came backstage afterward, asking why he barely had any lines. I kept my notes and my applause. Story 43. At a gym I used to go to, one particularly loud guy mocked my light weights during a warm-up, flexing dramatically and telling his buddies, "That's my warm-up weight too." I ignored him, but a few minutes later, he tried to show off by maxing out on the bench press without a spotter. Halfway up, the bar stalled and started coming back down, fast. 2 other people rushed over to help before he could get pinned. The rest of his workout was spent doing light dumbbell curls while avoiding eye contact with anyone, including me. Story 44. I once went to a board game cafe with a group of friends, and one guy I barely knew immediately started mocking me for taking games too seriously because I read the rules before starting. He refused to listen, saying he already knew how to play, and started making moves completely against the rules. 10 minutes in, he realized his mistake had given me a huge advantage, and I ended up winning the game in record time. He sulked for the rest of the night, while everyone else kept asking me to pick the next game because I actually knew what I was doing. Story 45. When I worked as a hotel front desk clerk, a guest came in late at night, irritated from a long drive. He started mocking my scripted welcome and joked to his wife that I was just reading from a cue card. Then he tossed his ID on the desk and told me to hurry it up. I typed his name into the system. Nothing came up. After double-checking, it turned out he'd booked the wrong dates, for the wrong location entirely. The nearest available room was at another property 40 miles away. The smirk dropped instantly as he realized he'd have to get back in the car and keep driving. Meanwhile, I went back to checking in the next polite guest without missing a beat. Story 46. I used to work in a busy bakery, and every morning a man would come in, make a big show of counting his change slowly, and mock me for being stuck serving muffins instead of doing something meaningful. One Saturday, he did the same routine in front of a long line, smirking as if he was putting on a performance. When he finally paid, he stepped back to grab his coffee, tripped over the leg of a chair, and sent the entire cup flying onto his crisp white shirt. The steam made him yelp, and the splash left a huge brown stain right in the middle. The line of customers stifled their laughter while I handed him a stack of napkins without saying a word. Story 47. At a neighborhood BBQ, my next-door neighbor Mark started making jokes about my tiny grill compared to his massive, shiny setup. He laughed and told everyone he'd show how real barbecue is done. About 20 minutes later, thick black smoke started billowing from his side of the yard. He'd left the lid down and overheated the coals, charring every piece of meat he had. His guests ended up coming over to my tiny grill to get food, and I served out perfectly cooked burgers, while Mark tried to scrape blackened steaks into the trash. Story 48. When I worked as a substitute teacher, I had a class where one student, Jake, loudly mocked me every time I asked for quiet, calling me rookie and telling his friends I wasn't scary. About halfway through the period, he decided to throw a pencil across the room to impress his friends. What he didn't realize was that the principal happened to be walking by the door at that exact moment. She came in, saw the pencil on the floor, and escorted him straight to the office. I didn't see him again for the rest of the day, and the rest of the class stayed perfectly quiet after that. Story 49. I once played in a casual weekend soccer league. During warm-ups, a guy from the other team mocked my cheap, beat-up cleats loud enough for everyone to hear, saying I should invest in real shoes. The game started, and about 10 minutes in, he tried to make a dramatic slide tackle. His brand-new expensive cleats got stuck in the turf, twisting his ankle. He had to sit out the rest of the match while I scored 2 goals in my cheap shoes. After the game, he didn't have much to say as he limped off the field. Story 50. At an art fair, I was working at a small booth selling handmade pottery. A man stopped, picked up one of my pieces, and scoffed, "Looks like something my kid made in school." He laughed and walked away, heading toward a booth with mass-produced, factory-made bowls. About an hour later, a couple walked up to my booth and bought 3 of my more expensive pieces for their gallery. As I was wrapping them, the same man came back, saw the transaction, and asked if I had any of the bowl he'd mocked earlier. I smiled and said, "Sorry, that one just sold." The look on his face was almost better than the sale itself. Story 51. When I worked as a junior flight attendant, there was a passenger in first class who mocked me for being too nervous, because I double-checked the overhead bins before takeoff. He told the guy next to him, loud enough for me to hear, "She's acting like we're going to crash." About an hour into the flight, turbulence hit, and a loose bag fell from a bin a few rows ahead. I had secured his bin earlier so nothing fell on him, but the passenger who'd been laughing at me got hit in the shoulder by his friend's falling water bottle. He didn't say a word to me for the rest of the flight, and kept his seatbelt on the entire time. Story 52. At a summer music festival, I wore a wide-brim hat and sunscreen because I burn easily. A group of people nearby, especially one guy, kept mocking me, calling me Grandpa, and pretending to fan themselves dramatically whenever I walked past. By mid-afternoon, the sun was blazing, and that same guy had ditched his shirt and was visibly red. By evening, he was walking gingerly, holding his arms away from his body, his face tight with pain. The next day, I saw him at the food stalls, covered head to toe in loose clothing, wincing every time someone brushed against him. My grandpa hat saved me from even a hint of burn. Story 53. When I was a cashier at a hardware store, a man mocked me for scanning items too slowly, saying, "I bet self-checkout would do a better job." I stayed polite and finished his transaction. He immediately headed to the self-checkout to prove his point by scanning a second batch of items. Within a minute, he had accidentally double-scanned several things, missed others, and triggered the system's fraud alert. The machine froze, flashing, "Please wait for assistance." I was the one called over to reset it. I took my time. He avoided eye contact while mumbling thanks. Story 54. At a small-town farmer's market, I was sampling homemade hot sauce when a guy nearby loudly joked to his friends, "That's baby stuff. Give me the real heat." The vendor handed him a toothpick dipped in their hottest blend, warning it wasn't for beginners. He ignored the advice, popped the whole thing in his mouth, and within seconds was coughing, sweating, and begging for water. His friends recorded the whole thing on their phones while I calmly bought a bottle of the mild sauce and walked away smiling. Story 55. In college, I worked part-time at a coffee shop, and one regular always teased me for needing the register. Instead of calculating change in my head, he bragged about being great with numbers and insisted he'd never need a calculator. One day, while he was waiting for his drink, he decided to show off by solving a tricky math problem his friend found online. He got the answer wrong by a huge margin, and when his friend corrected him, the whole group burst out laughing. I handed him his drink and said, "Good thing coffee doesn't require math," which got a chuckle from everyone in line. Story 56. Back when I worked as a hotel housekeeper, there was a guest who mocked me in the hallway for just cleaning up after people, and even told his friends I probably lived in the broom closet. Later that day, I was assigned to tidy his room. When I walked in, I saw he'd left his expensive watch on the desk. I'm honest, so I left it right where it was. A couple of hours later, he came storming to the front desk, demanding to know who stole it. Security pulled up camera footage showing him putting it in his own suitcase, then forgetting he had. He had to apologize to everyone in the lobby, including me. Story 57. At a community cooking class, I was making bread dough when a guy across the table laughed and said I was kneading like an amateur and bragged about his perfect technique. He was throwing flour around dramatically for show, ignoring the instructor's tips. Halfway through, his dough was too dry to shape, and he tried to fix it by adding water too late. The result was a sticky, unusable mess. He had to start over from scratch while mine came out perfectly baked, and the instructor used my loaf as the class example. Story 58. I once took a weekend sailing course. One man in the group constantly made fun of me for double knotting my ropes and wasting time checking my knots twice. On the final day, we had to dock in choppy water. He tied his boat quickly, smirking at me struggling with mine. Moments later, his rope slipped loose and his boat drifted several feet from the dock. The instructor and I had to help pull it back while he scrambled in panic. My wasted time knots held perfectly the whole time. Story 59. At a corporate retreat, we had a ropes course challenge. I'm not a fan of heights, and a coworker named Linda kept teasing me about being scared of a little ladder. She rushed ahead, determined to be first to finish. Halfway across a high bridge, she lost her balance and froze, too terrified to move forward or back. The guide had to climb up and help her inch across while everyone watched. When it was my turn, I went slowly but steadily and made it without a single slip. Afterward, she didn't have much to say about my pace. Story 60. In a writing workshop, I was quietly taking notes when another attendee leaned over and whispered, "You're writing like you're in grade school," smirking at my bullet points. When it came time to share our drafts, she went first, reading a piece full of grammar mistakes and run-on sentences. The instructor asked her to rewrite several sections. Then I read mine, which was praised for its clarity and structure. The same attendee ended up asking if I'd be willing to look over her work in the future. I said I'd think about it. Story 61. When I was a lifeguard at a public pool, a group of teenagers came in, and one of them immediately started mocking me for just sitting in a chair with a whistle. He kept pretending to drown in shallow water to make his friends laugh. About an hour later, he decided to dive off the side into the deep end, without realizing another swimmer was right below him. He landed awkwardly, hit his leg, and couldn't get back up quickly. I had to blow the whistle, jump in, and help him to the side. His friends went completely quiet, and he didn't pull another fake drowning stunt again. Story 62. At a winter wedding, I wore boots with good traction because the walkway to the venue was icy. A cousin I barely knew made a snide comment about how I looked like I was headed to shovel snow instead of a wedding. She tottered inside in high heels, smirking. Later, when the reception ended, she stepped outside and immediately slipped on the ice, landing flat on her back in her fancy dress. Guests rushed to help her up, while I walked steadily to my car without a problem. Story 63. During a photography workshop, I brought a basic, older camera model while others had high-end gear. One guy, Greg, laughed and told me, "You can't take a professional shot with a toy." When the instructor announced a competition for the best photo of the day, Greg rushed around chasing flashy subjects while I took my time. My shot, of a quiet street corner with perfect lighting, won first place. The instructor even used it as an example of composition over equipment. Greg didn't place at all. Story 64. I once worked in a call center where a coworker named Jenna constantly mocked my too nice phone voice, saying customers would walk all over me. One afternoon, she got a notoriously difficult client on the line who was already yelling. She tried her usual curt approach and got hung up on. The call was reassigned to me, and within 5 minutes I had the client laughing and agreeing to renew their service contract. Our manager complimented me in front of the team. Jenna didn't have much to say after that. Story 65. At a weekend camping trip with friends, I brought a waterproof tarp to put under my tent. A guy named Rick teased me all evening about overpacking and bringing too much gear for a little drizzle. That night, the drizzle turned into a full-on downpour. By morning, everyone else's tents were soaked through, including Rick's sleeping bag and clothes. My tent stayed bone dry, and I had hot coffee ready while he tried to wring water out of his socks over the campfire. Story 66. Back in high school, I was in the marching band, and our practice field was right next to the football teams. One of the players, Tyler, constantly yelled things like "nice pajamas" at us when we wore our uniforms. During the homecoming game, Tyler decided to show off and do a flashy touchdown celebration by flipping into the end zone. He misjudged the landing, twisted his ankle, and had to be carried off the field. Meanwhile, our band kept playing, and the crowd actually cheered louder for us than the touchdown. Story 67. When I worked at a bookstore, a man came to the counter with a pile of books and mocked me for needing the computer to look up prices. He went on about how, back in his day, people had brains. I rang him up without saying much. He paid, then came back 5 minutes later, red-faced, saying he'd been charged more than he expected. Turns out one of the books he picked was a special collector's edition with a higher price clearly marked on the cover. I pointed it out, and he muttered something about not having his glasses before leaving quickly. Story 68. At a local 5K charity run, I was doing a slow warm-up jog when another runner came up beside me and said, "You'll never finish at that pace." He then sprinted ahead to show off. About halfway through the course, I passed him. He was doubled over, catching his breath and drinking from a water station like he'd just run a marathon. I finished the race at my steady pace, while he came in several minutes after me. The event photographer even caught the moment I passed him, and the picture ended up in the community newsletter. Story 69. During a home renovation, I hired a plumber to help with some work. My neighbor, who considered himself a handyman, mocked me for wasting money and said he could do that in his sleep. A week later, I came home to see water pouring out of his garage. He'd tried to fix his own leaky pipe and ended up flooding half the space. The plumber I hired ended up going over to help him for double the cost I paid because it was now an emergency. Story 70. I used to volunteer at an animal shelter, and one new volunteer laughed at me for wearing old jeans and boots instead of cute clothes like hers. She said I looked like I'd just rolled out of the barn. That day, we had to help move a group of energetic dogs into the play yard. One of them jumped up on her, covering her expensive outfit in muddy paw prints and drool. She spent the rest of the shift trying to scrub her clothes in the bathroom while I kept working, completely comfortable in my barn gear. Story 71. When I worked as a museum guide, there was a man in one of my tour groups who kept interrupting to correct me on historical facts. He even winked at his wife as if he was doing her a favor by fact-checking me. Halfway through, we got to a rare artifact, and I asked if anyone knew its origin. He jumped in with an answer, completely wrong. Without missing a beat, I explained the real history, and another guest, who turned out to be a professor of archaeology, backed me up and expanded on my explanation. The man stayed silent for the rest of the tour, avoiding eye contact. Story 72. At a summer community baseball game, I was put in right field, a position some think is just for the weakest player. A teammate I barely knew shouted, "Don't worry, nothing ever happens in right field," loud enough for the opposing team to hear. 2 innings later, a batter hit a deep fly ball straight toward me. I caught it mid-run, then threw it cleanly to home plate for an out, stopping the other team from scoring. My teammate didn't say a word for the rest of the game, and a few others came up afterward to compliment my throw. Story 73. When I worked in a busy downtown cafe, a man ordered a complicated drink and then mocked me for double-checking the ingredients with him, saying, "It's not rocket science." He bragged to the person behind him about how fast he made lattes at home. When I handed him his drink, he took one sip, frowned, and said it was wrong. I calmly pointed to the order slip he'd signed. He'd given me the wrong specifications. He sheepishly admitted his mistake and paid for a second drink. Story 74. During a local trivia night, a guy at my table laughed when I said I wasn't great at sports questions, calling me dead weight for round 4. Sure enough, when the sports round came, most questions were obscure, except one about Olympic figure skating, which I happened to know from watching with my sister growing up. I answered it right, and it was the deciding point that won us the game. The guy bought the next round of drinks, but his dead weight joke didn't come up again. Story 75. At a home improvement store, I was picking up supplies for a project, including safety goggles. A man nearby smirked and said, "You really need those for a little home project?" He bragged about working with tools since before you were born, and walked off. 10 minutes later, I passed him in the tool aisle holding a paper towel to his eye. He'd been cutting a piece of wood and got sawdust in it. One of the employees had to lead him to the eyewash station. My goggles suddenly didn't seem so unnecessary. Story 76. Back in college, I joined a beginner's fencing club. At my first session, one of the more experienced guys smirked at my cautious stance and whispered to another member, "He's going to get destroyed." During the practice match, he came at me aggressively, clearly trying to end it fast. But he overextended, leaving his side completely open. I landed the winning touch in less than 10 seconds. The instructor laughed and told the group, "Textbook counterattack," while the guy quietly walked off to get water. Story 77. At a crowded ski lodge, I was putting on a helmet before hitting the slopes. A guy nearby looked at his friend and said, "Some people are so paranoid. What's the worst that could happen?" He went down the hill ahead of me, trying to show off with little jumps. On his third jump, he caught an edge and face-planted hard. Ski patrol had to help him down with a bloody nose. When I passed him in the lodge later, he was holding an ice pack and avoiding eye contact. My helmet stayed firmly on for the rest of the day.